Well, God bless you, brothers and sisters. This is now part 6 in our Bible study in the book of Philippians. And I have a story that I want to share with you today. I think it illustrates the lesson in our Bible study. This story, it's a story about Abraham Lincoln. It's a story about an assassination attempt on his life. But this was 4 years before he actually was assassinated in 1865. This was a story that begins in 1860 and then into 1861. This is a story that is taken from Smithsonian Magazine. It's a historical account of something that happened in Abraham Lincoln's life. This is an excerpt from that story. As he awaited the outcome of the voting on election night, November the 6th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln sat expectantly in the Springfield, Illinois telegraph office. The results came in by wire around 2 a.m. Lincoln had won the election. Even as jubilation erupted around him, Lincoln calmly kept watch until the results came in from Springfield, Illinois, confirming that he had carried his hometown, the town that he had called home for a quarter of a century. Only then did he return home, and he woke up Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, and he said to her, "Mary, Mary, we are elected." Now, by the year 1861, he was already beleaguered by volumes of correspondence that were reaching his desk there in Springfield, Illinois. So he was the newly elected president, and he was being flooded with mail. And so on one occasion, he was spotted at the post office filling a good-sized market basket with his latest batch of letters that he had written. Soon, Lincoln had to hire an assistant to help him with the burden. And so he hired John Nicolay, a young Bavarian immigrant, to be his private secretary. Nicolay was immediately troubled by the growing number of threats that crossed Lincoln's desk. In other words, Abraham Lincoln was getting a lot of hate mail. And this is what John Nicolay said, quote, "His mail was infested with brutal and vulgar menace, and warnings of all sorts were coming to him from his nervous friends." So he was getting a lot of warnings from his friends that his life was in danger. But John Nicolay goes on to say, "But he had himself so sane a mind and a heart so kindly, even toward his enemies." In the coming weeks, it was clear that the task of planning Lincoln's railway journey from Springfield, Illinois to his inauguration in the nation's capital on March the 4th would present daunting security challenges. The task would prove all the more formidable because Lincoln insisted that he utterly disliked display and pageantry, and he would make his way to Washington without a military escort. So that was his own choice. But far from Springfield, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at least one railway executive, Samuel Felton, he was president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. He believed that the president-elect Lincoln had failed to grasp the seriousness of the danger and of his position. Rumors had reached Felton that rebels might be mounting a deep-laid conspiracy to prevent the inauguration of Mr. Lincoln in the capital of the country in Washington, D.C. For Felton, whose railroad line formed a crucial link between Washington, D.C. and the North, the threat against Lincoln and his government also constituted a danger to the railroad, and Felton decided to investigate the matter, and it's a good thing that he did. There was an independent operative, an independent agent who had already proven himself in the service of the railroads. Snatching up his pen, Felton dashed off an urgent plea to a celebrated detective who resided in the West. By the end of January, with barely 2 weeks remaining before Lincoln was to depart Springfield for Washington, D.C., Alan Pinkerton was on the case. Pinkerton was a Scottish immigrant who had started out as a cooper making barrels in a small town in Illinois. He had made a name for himself when he helped to snare a ring of counterfeiters. He had gone on to serve as the first official detective for the city of Chicago. He was admired as being incorruptible. He was one of the untouchables, in other words. By the time Felton sought him out, the 41-year-old Pinkerton was the head of his own Pinkerton Detective Agency, and among his clients was the Illinois Central Railroad. Felton's letter landed on Pinkerton's desk in Chicago on January the 19th, and the detective was in Felton's Philadelphia office only 2 days later. Pinkerton listened to the railroad president outline his concerns. If the rebels intended to disrupt Lincoln's inauguration, which was now only 6 weeks away, any attack would come soon, perhaps within days. Pinkerton departed immediately for the seat of danger, Baltimore, Maryland. Virtually any route that the president-elect chose between Springfield and Washington would have to pass through the city of Baltimore. It was a major seaport, and Baltimore had a population of more than 200,000 at that time, which was nearly twice that of the population of Chicago in 1861. Pinkerton brought with him a crew of agents, among them one man named Harry Davies. He was a young man who had a gift for adapting himself to any situation. Davies possessed a thorough knowledge of the South, its localities and its prejudices, its customs and its leading men, which he had gleaned from several years' residence in New Orleans and other southern cities. Pinkerton and his agents arrived in Baltimore during the first week of February, taking rooms at a boarding house near the Camden Street train station. He and his operatives fanned out across the city, mixing with crowds at saloons, hotels, and restaurants to try to gather intelligence. Quoting from what Pinkerton later wrote, "The opposition to Lincoln's inauguration was most violent and most bitter, and a few days' sojourn in Baltimore convinced me that great danger was to be apprehended." Pinkerton decided to set himself up with a cover identity, pretending to be a newly arrived Southern stockbroker, and he took the name John Hutchinson. It was a wise choice, as it gave him an excuse to make himself known to the city's businessmen, whose interests in cotton and other Southern commodities often gave a fair index of their political leanings. In order to play the part convincingly, Pinkerton rented a suite of offices in a large building on South Street there in Baltimore. Harry Davies, meanwhile, the young agent working for Pinkerton, he assumed the character of an extremely radical anti-union man from New Orleans, and he took a room at one of Baltimore's best hotels, Barnum's. He immediately began to make himself known as a man who was willing to pledge his loyalty and his pocketbook to the interests of the Southern rebels. Meanwhile, back in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln offered up the first details of his itinerary. Lincoln announced that he would travel to Washington, D.C. in an open and public fashion, with frequent stops along the way to greet the public. His route would cover 2,000 miles. He would arrive at Baltimore's Calvert Street station at 12:30 on the afternoon of Saturday, February the 23rd, and he would depart the Camden Street Station at 3 p.m. Instantly, the announcement of Lincoln's imminent arrival became the talk of Baltimore. Of all the stops on Lincoln's itinerary, Baltimore, Maryland was the only slave-holding city along the way. There was a distinct possibility that Maryland would even vote to secede from the Union by the time that Lincoln's train reached its border. So Pinkerton later wrote this, quote, "Every night as I mingled among the leading men of Baltimore, I could hear the most outrageous sentiments being enunciated." A timetable for Lincoln's journey was supplied to the press. From the moment the train departed Springfield, Illinois, anyone wishing to cause harm would be able to track Lincoln's movements in unprecedented detail, even at some points down to the minute. All the while, moreover, Lincoln continued to receive daily threats of death and harm. In Baltimore, meanwhile, Harry Davies, again the agent for Pinkerton, set to work cultivating the friendship of a young man named Otis Hillard, a hard-drinking regular at Barnum's. Hillard wore a gold badge stamped with a palmetto. It was the symbol of South Carolina's secession from the Union. Hillard had recently signed on as a lieutenant in the Palmetto Guards, one of the several secret military organizations springing up in Baltimore. This would be like the Proud Boys of their day, or like the Oath Keepers of their day. Pinkerton had targeted Hillard because of his association with Barnum's. Quoting Pinkerton, "Visitors from all over the South gathered at Barnum's, and in the evenings the corridors and parlors would be thronged by the men who represented the slave-holding aristocracy." Although Harry Davies claimed to have come to Baltimore on business, at every turn he would quietly insinuate that he was far more interested in matters of the rebellion. On the morning of Monday, February the 11th, 1861, about 3 weeks before Inauguration Day, the train bells sounded, and signaling the hour of departure from Springfield, Illinois. Moments later, the Lincoln Special, as the train was named, the Lincoln Special gathered steam and pushed east toward Indianapolis with the president-elect on board. The next day, Tuesday, February the 12th, a significant break came for Pinkerton and Harry Davies. In Harry Davies' hotel room, he and Hillard sat talking into the early hours of the morning. Hillard opened up and outlined his knowledge of a coded system that would allow the president-elect's train to be tracked from stop to stop, even if telegraph communications were being monitored for suspicious activities. When the two men parted, Hillard cautioned Davies to say nothing of what had passed between them. Meanwhile, Pinkerton, posing as the gregarious stockbroker Hutchinson, he was engaged in regular conversations with businessman James Luckett. Pinkerton steered the conversation toward Lincoln's impending passage through Baltimore. At the mention of Lincoln's journey, Luckett turned suddenly cautious. Quoting Luckett, quote, "He may pass through quietly, but I doubt it." Seizing his opportunity, Pinkerton pulled out his wallet, counted out a sum of money with dramatic flourish, and then he said to Luckett, "Take this. I am but a stranger to you, but I have no doubt money is necessary for the success of our cause." Pressing the money into Luckett's hand, Pinkerton asked that the donation be used, quote, "in the best manner possible." Luckett took the money, and he invited Pinkerton to meet him later at Barr's Saloon, on South Street there in Baltimore, where Pinkerton could meet some other men who Luckett said had a plan to see to it that Lincoln would never reach Washington, D.C. and never become the president. Now, it was clear to Pinkerton that a warning must now be sent to Abraham Lincoln. Years before, during his early days in Chicago, Pinkerton had often encountered Norman Judd, the former Illinois state senator who had worked for Lincoln's campaign and election. Judd, Pinkerton knew, was now aboard the Lincoln Special train with the President-elect Lincoln. Pinkerton sent a telegram to Judd, quote, "I have a message for you of importance. Where can it reach you by special messenger?" On the night of February the 12th, Pinkerton went to Barr's Saloon to keep his appointment with Luckett. Quoting Pinkerton, "Luckett introduced me to his friends as a resident of Georgia who was an earnest worker in the cause of secession, whose sympathy and discretion could be implicitly relied upon." One of the leading men among the rebels warmed to the detective immediately. After ordering drinks and cigars, the group withdrew to a quiet corner. Within moments, Pinkerton heard expressions of high treason. The rebel leader said that he and his fellow Southerners had been outraged by the election of Lincoln, and they justified resorting to any means to prevent Lincoln from taking the White House. By Sunday, February the 17th, Pinkerton had pieced together his rumors and reports and had formed a working theory of the rebels' plan to assassinate Lincoln. A crowd would meet the Lincoln Special train at the Calvert Street Depot in Baltimore, and here it was prearranged that only a small force of policemen would be stationed. And as Lincoln arrived, a disturbance would be created. While the police rushed off to deal with this diversion, it would be an easy task for a determined man to shoot Lincoln and then, aided by his companions, succeed in making his escape. Pinkerton was convinced that Otis Hillard held the key to uncovering the final details of the plot, as well as the identity of the designated assassin. The next evening, February the 18th, Hillard and undercover agent Harry Davies dined together. Hillard confirmed that his so-called National Volunteers might soon draw lots to see who would kill Lincoln. At hearing this, Davies demanded that he be taken to this meeting, insisting that he too should be given the opportunity to be the man who would murder the president-elect. 2 days later, on February the 20th, Hillard returned to Davies in exuberant spirits. If Davies would be willing to swear an oath of loyalty to the volunteers, then Davies could join them that night. As evening fell, Hillard conducted Davies to the home of a man well known among the rebels. The pair were ushered into a large drawing room where 20 men stood waiting silently. In the flickering light of candles, the rebels formed a circle as Davies was sworn in. Paper ballots had been placed in a wooden chest on a table, and one by one the rebels drew a folded secret ballot. If a red ballot was drawn, it meant you are the one chosen to kill Abraham Lincoln. The meeting was then adjourned. Hillard and Davies walked out into the darkened streets together, after first withdrawing to a private corner to open their folded ballots. Davies' own ballot paper was blank, a fact that he conveyed to Hillard with an expression of disappointment. Davies at that time told Hillard that he worried that the man who had been chosen, whoever he was, to carry it out, that he would lose his nerve at the crucial moment. At that time, then, Hillard confided to Harry Davies that the wooden box had contained not one, but 8 red ballots. So each man would believe, of the 8 men, each man would believe that he alone was the one charged with the task of murdering Lincoln. And in that way, if even 1 or 2 should fail to act, at least one of the others would be certain to strike the fatal blow. By the morning of February 21st, the Lincoln Special was on its approach toward Philadelphia. Pinkerton had already traveled back to Philadelphia by this time while he was putting the finishing touches on a plan of operation he had devised in Baltimore. It had been only 3 weeks since he had first met with Felton. Pinkerton believed that if he could hurry Lincoln through Baltimore well ahead of schedule, the assassins would be caught off guard, and by the time the rebels took their places for the train's February 23rd arrival in Baltimore, Lincoln would already be safe in Washington, D.C. Pinkerton knew that what he was proposing would be risky and perhaps even foolhardy, because even if Lincoln was ahead of schedule, the route to the capital would still pass through Baltimore in any case, and if any hint of a change of plan leaked out, then Lincoln's position would become far more precarious. Instead of traveling openly with his full complement of friends and protectors, he would be traveling ahead of schedule in secret, and he would be relatively alone and exposed with only 1 or 2 men at his side. That being the case, Pinkerton knew that secrecy was even more critical than ever. Shortly after 9 a.m. there in Philadelphia, Pinkerton met again with Felton, the man he was working for. Pinkerton told Felton that his investigation left no room for doubt. There is an attempt being made to assassinate Mr. Lincoln. If Lincoln abides by his current itinerary from the moment he arrives at the Baltimore depot, he will be in mortal peril. Pinkerton said, "My advice is that Mr. Lincoln should proceed to Washington, D.C. this evening by the 11 o'clock regular passenger train." Lincoln could cover more than 200 miles that night, running in darkness for most of the route, with 2 changes of train. The revised scheme would accomplish Pinkerton's original goal of bringing Lincoln through Baltimore earlier than expected, and in addition, Lincoln would make his approach to the city on a different rail line and arrive at a different station. So Pinkerton's plan depended upon the privacy of an ordinary sleeping compartment being sufficient to conceal Lincoln's presence. Late that evening, after the Lincoln Special had arrived in Philadelphia, Pinkerton managed to get a hastily arranged meeting with the President-elect, Abraham Lincoln. Pinkerton carefully reviewed the circumstances connected with the assassination attempt and the men who were, quote, ready and willing to die to rid their country of a tyrant, as they considered Lincoln to be. Pinkerton told Lincoln in blunt terms that if he kept to the published schedule, an assault of some kind would be made upon his person with a view of taking his life. Quoting Pinkerton, who later said this, "During the entire conversation, Abraham Lincoln did not evince the slightest evidence of agitation or fear. Calm and self-possessed, his only sentiments appeared to be those of profound regret that the rebels could be so far led away by the excitement of the hour as to consider his death a necessity for the furtherance of their cause." Lincoln rose from his chair, and now quoting Lincoln, "I cannot go tonight," he said firmly. "I have promised to raise the flag over Independence Hall tomorrow morning and to visit the legislature at Harrisburg in the afternoon. Beyond that, I have no engagements. Any plan that may be adopted that will enable me to fulfill those promises, I will agree to, and you can inform me what is concluded upon tomorrow." With these words, Lincoln turned and left the room. Pinkerton had no alternative but to accede to Lincoln's wishes, and he immediately set to work on a new plan. Struggling to anticipate all the contingencies that could be imagined, Pinkerton worked through the entire night. The Lincoln Special pulled away from the West Philadelphia depot at 9:30 the next morning, bound for Harrisburg. Arriving in Harrisburg at 1:30 p.m. and making his way to Jones House Hotel with his host, Governor Andrew Curtin, Abraham Lincoln decided to bring Curtin into his confidence. He told the governor that a conspiracy had been discovered to assassinate him in Baltimore on his way through that city the next day. Curtin, who had forged a close alliance with Lincoln during the presidential campaign, pledged his full cooperation. He reported that, quote, "Lincoln seemed pained and surprised that a design to take his life existed. Nevertheless, he remained very calm, and neither in his conversation or manner exhibited any alarm or fear." Now, to bring this story to its conclusion, that evening, the President-elect Lincoln, having fulfilled all his obligations and keeping all his promises, he agreed to Pinkerton's plan of action, and he boarded a regular passenger train. So Lincoln was no longer aboard the Lincoln Special, which was unknown to the general public. The President-elect passed through Baltimore at an earlier time than previously planned, and on a regular passenger train in an ordinary sleeping compartment. Lincoln arrived safely in Washington, D.C., and of course he was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1861. And a little over 4 years later, in 1865, after a bloody civil war, the assassins succeeded in killing Abraham Lincoln, of course, as you know. All during his presidency for 4 years, Abraham Lincoln showed no fear, and he did not concede to fear. He knew he was hated by many people. He knew that there were many who wanted to see him dead. But Abraham Lincoln often mingled openly on the streets with the people. Lincoln once said this, quote, "If I am killed, I can die but once, but to live in constant dread of it is to die over and over again." In a speech to Congress, Lincoln said this, quote, "And having thus chosen our course without guile and with pure purpose, let us renew our trust in God, and let us go forward without fear." Abraham Lincoln's courage was a testimony to his enemies that he had faith in God and that he was confident of his course, he was confident of his purpose, and he was confident of his future. I think that this story very well illustrates for us what the Apostle Paul has written for us. We're looking at the last 4 verses in chapter 1 of the book of Philippians. "Let your conversation be as becomes the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel." This is what the Apostle Paul has written down, the inspired Word of God. And what he's saying here is that whatever happens, that we should conduct ourselves in a manner that is worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so then he says to the church, "Whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you're standing firm in one spirit and contending as one for the faith of the gospel." So in other words, what Paul is saying in a nutshell, brothers and sisters, live for Jesus and stand firm and stand up for the faith. It's been said that a sleeping man may end up in hell, but a man who is on his way to heaven must be awake. He must be alert. He must take his stand. Stick to the Lord, in other words, stick to the gospel, and at all times, be aware, be awake, be alert, and stick to what we believe in as Christians. Stick to it and stand together in it, and live for Jesus. Stand firm and contend for the gospel. Be willing to strive for the advancement of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in nothing terrified by your adversaries, which is to them an evident token of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that of God. So in other words, this is saying, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you, for this is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. So in other words, live without fear. Don't be afraid of the enemies of God, for this is a sign to them that they're on the wrong side of God. When they see your courage and they see your faith and that you're not afraid, that's a sign to them that they're on the wrong side and that you're on the right side, because you have confidence in your God, and you have confidence in the future, and you have confidence that you're on the right side and that you will be vindicated by God, and that those who persecute you are showing by what they're doing, it's a sign of their ruin. They're on their way to ruin, to wreck and ruin. As we talked about in our example of Abraham Lincoln, he showed no fear. He had no fear. He was confident. He was confident of his future. He was confident that he was on the right course. He was confident that he was standing in the right and the good under God. And so he stood there, and he was without fear, and he was confident. For to you it is given in behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here to be in me. So in other words, what these last two verses in the chapter 1 are saying is, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle that you saw I had, and now here that I still have. So in other words, he's saying to suffer for Christ, you've been chosen. This is something that's only given as a blessing. And he's saying, just as I am being persecuted, you also are being persecuted. They were going through persecutions also. The church in Philippi was being persecuted. The enemies of Christ can do nothing to us except something that God will turn around for our good and for the glory of God. So in other words, what the Apostle Paul is saying here is, in a nutshell, is be confident, live for the Lord, and be confident, and don't give in to fear, because when you give in to fear, you're giving in to the enemy. Don't give in to the enemy. Just as Abraham Lincoln was an example, he never gave in to the enemy. He stood his ground. The Apostle Paul never gave in to the enemy. He stood his ground. Persecution came. Yes, the Apostle Paul was eventually beheaded. Abraham Lincoln was eventually assassinated. Yes, persecution comes when we stand strong. But as Lincoln said, if I am killed, I can die but once. They can only kill me one time. They may kill me, but they can only do it one time. But to live in constant dread of it is to die over and over again. A brave man dies once, but a coward dies 1,000 deaths, because he's afraid of death, and he fears it, and he lives it in constant fear of it. And so that is what Lincoln is saying. Remember what Lincoln said in his speech to Congress. He said, having thus chosen our course, as Christians we have chosen our course. Having thus chosen our course, without guile, without hypocrisy, and with pure purpose, with a pure heart, in other words, on a straight path, let us renew our trust in God, and let us go forward without fear.